And today, Los Angeles Unified Schools open with 97% of all students coming back. And so we know that this is a scary time given what's happening with the variant, but there are safety measures and COVID mitigation measures that we believe that can make it possible for our students to have in-person instruction. Obviously, the state does allow some independent study for those students who have a medical necessity or need to have some alternative to in-person instruction. But we've learned that our students need in-person instruction, that they've suffered the lack of access to educators and peers. And we know that mental health needs have grown and that our learning gaps have been exacerbated. Our office has worked with our governor, with Governor Newsom and others, to secure 5 million rapid COVID tests that are available to support our schools. And so we can do this and we must do this for our kids. In the weeks leading up to the opening of schools, our office has continued to push on our message about the importance of vaccinations. We recognize that many students have experienced the trauma of the pandemic. And so billions being provided for counseling, more than $4 billion available for mental health services for young people from ages of birth to the age of 25, more than $3 billion for community schools so that you have wraparound supports, health and mental health, and also supporting families. Billions spent so that we have a thing called universal meals. That means that any student who wants a meal can get a meal regardless of their background, regardless of income, no need to have a lot of paperwork. We have universal transitional kindergarten for every 4-year-old. That means that we recognize that many students haven't had access to being on a campus, and now there's universal transitional kindergarten for our kids, including more subsidized programs in childcare for our very young children to be able to get what they need. There's so many mitigation measures I want to tell you about. We've given money to our schools to support outdoor classrooms, air purification systems and air filtration, improving ventilation, making sure that there's PPE. We're working on everything to support the mental well-being of our students, their physical safety, and of course, what we call the acceleration of learning. That just means that we want to recognize that many of our students suffered during the pandemic and that learning gaps that we were working to close were exacerbated during the pandemic. I can tell you that we are stepping up every effort that we can to encourage vaccines. I think it's hard when you have a whole group of our school population that cannot get a vaccine. As you know, everyone under the age of 12 cannot get a vaccine. We're waiting for FDA approvals, and we expect that those approvals will happen later this year. In the meantime, what we can do is have regular COVID testing intervals for those who cannot be vaccinated. And right now, that is the expectation that there is COVID testing for anyone who does not have a vaccine in our schools. And we have a number of districts that have now mandated vaccines for all the adult staff to have a vaccine. In LA Unified, our largest school district in the state, the mandate is that they have a vaccine by October. We have other districts that have passed mandates or are discussing mandates, but what is required by law is that everyone have either a vaccine or that they submit to regular COVID testing. And so in the meantime, we are trying everything we can do to reach families. We've been using incentives. We've been giving out $100 gift cards to anyone who will get a vaccine. We continue to talk about it. We continue to have trusted messengers talk about the vaccines because we hear it from people who have fears. They think that if they get a vaccine, that it's going to somehow affect their fertility, their abilities to become a parent, that it may have some other damage or harm to them, that they think this is sort of new science. And we've let them know that this has been developed over many years, and we're grateful to have it. And that without these vaccines, people may literally lose their lives. And I know that we're seeing an increase in the number of young children without a vaccine. So any parents who will hear the broadcast or from this conversation, we want to encourage the adults to get a vaccine, especially if you have children who cannot be vaccinated. We've seen what I call the pandemic of racism, certainly starting with the killing of George Floyd on national television before our very eyes. And during the pandemic, I launched a new initiative called Education to End Hate, providing implicit bias training to educators in our schools. We've seen the spike in hate against our Asian American and Pacific Islander families. We've seen the mistreatment of immigrant children and unaccompanied minors. And so we are sending a message by talking about ethnic studies. During the pandemic, we created a new guide for how school districts can create their own ethnic studies curriculum. So students of color can learn about the contributions of their ancestors to make this a great state. And of course, there's legislation still being heard that might create an ethnic studies graduation requirement. All these things we're putting together to find ways to grow from these ashes to support an education system that does a better job of supporting our 6 million students. And my office has brought leaders together to talk about ways to encourage partnership and to ensure safety for our schools. We're working with leaders who've created curriculum to teach about the contributions of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in our communities. Our ethnic studies model curriculum talks about the contributions of Asian American and Pacific Islanders to make California a great state. And our Education to End Hate initiative has sent grants directly to school districts to provide training to counter any idea of bias, hate, or racism against any group, including our partners in the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. I would just say that any parent, if you think that anything is happening to address your child, please contact your school district immediately. But again, we're working closely with our educators to support our students. We've even created a statewide youth advisory council where young people, students, can help us lead in conversations about how to get past hate, how to get past bias, and how to create mutual understanding for supporting all of our students. Unfortunately, we've lived in a time when the pandemic has started where a culture of blame has been inappropriately attributed to some of our students, including Asian American and Pacific Islander students. We have to debunk any myths and flat out lies that have come from people like former President Trump and anyone else in any way who have equated anything about the coronavirus with our Asian American Pacific Islander families. It's just flat out not true. And we've been busy doing our part to educate our partners and again, to address any issues of bias that exist to make sure that our schools are safe. We have more counseling programs set up for our schools, more restorative justice programs set up for our schools, more community schools themselves. And we will work closely with our education leaders to help keep our schools safe for all of our students. Again, any families who feel like there's any danger at all, please contact your schools immediately, and we'll do our part to assist them as well.